So without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker for today. Dr. Micah Pollak is one of our professors of economics, and he's going to talk to you today about how the market forces impact your business. So I'm going to turn things over to Dr. Pollak.
Thank you, Jana. Hello, everybody, and welcome. Thanks for coming to this session on a really beautiful day. I know it's hard to compete with like the gorgeous outdoor weather, but I appreciate that you're here today. So I am going to talk to you today about market forces and your business. I'm an economist, as Jana said, at IU Northwest here. I'm also the director of the Center for Economic Education and Research, which does a lot of community outreach, and I do a lot of economic analysis and interpretations of the economy of Northwest Indiana and Indiana as a whole. And as an economist, I think a lot of people I find people misunderstand what economics really is. They think it's about the stock market or money and banking. And we do talk about those things sometimes, but really at its heart, economics is just understanding behavior, understanding behavior of individuals, firms, and really just understanding the way that the world works around you. And so today I want to focus a little bit on kind of a small business perspective of, if you have a small business or you work for a small business, you might feel a little overwhelmed with everything that's happening in the world and wondering, how do you navigate, this crazy ocean of, crazy storms of the economy. And so today I want to talk a little bit about how you can maybe organize things a little bit and have kind of a big picture perspective and how to deal with some of these kind of ups and downs that you may experience that with your business. I'm going to try to keep it as general as possible because everybody may have a totally different business, and one particular type of business is going to be very different from another. So I'll try to keep things as general and applicable to all businesses as possible. If you do have questions, at any point, you can type them in the Q&A chat, and I'll try to get to them. Or at the end, we'll have some time for questions, and if possible, I may have a few of you talk a little bit about your business or maybe some challenges you faced in the last few years. So to get started, I just want to kind of start off with a little bit of background about how wild the last few years have been in terms of economics and our economy. And if you have a small business, you run your manager may be in a business, you probably don't need to be told this. It's been absolutely crazy the last few years. We have had the COVID-19 pandemic, which has caused everything from, stay-at-home orders to supply chain disruptions to triggering what I like to call the great reassessment of labor, which is this big long-term change that's happening in the labor market, and it's probably not going to go away. Even once COVID-19 becomes less of a focus. We also have things like the war in Ukraine. We have inflation and the Federal Reserve changing interest rates, and concern about wages and political polarization, and becoming political. Whether you ask your people coming to your business to wear a mask or not. All of these things have made the last few years just absolutely a wild ride in terms of operating a business. And unfortunately, a lot of businesses haven't been able to navigate that. And we've had a lot of bankruptcies and longtime businesses closing down. And as a smaller business, it's especially challenging because you don't necessarily have that cushion of resources from maybe different operations or different markets that you can kind of lean on. And many times it's kind of a make or break from day to day for a small business. So it becomes really important to figure out how to navigate all of this crazy economic stuff that's going on. Just to give you kind of some specifics on how wild things have been, I just want to highlight a few economic variables that have changed just dramatically in the last 12 months. If you look at wages in Indiana, the average hourly wage in Indiana right now, and this is for retail workers, is $18.10 an hour. And a year ago, it was $16.45. So that's a 10% increase in wages in just 1 year. And so if you own a retail store, you have to figure out, how do you match these increases in wages? Where do you find the money to be able to pay your workers a lot more? If you look at the unemployment rate, right now we're at 2.2% unemployment. 1 year ago, we were at 4.2% unemployment. And we're probably close to our long run unemployment rate, meaning that we really can't employ that many more people that are unemployed, because a lot of this unemployment is just, frictional, where maybe someone is changing jobs or moving across the state, and there really aren't that many people out there to hire. And I think if you've again, own a small business, you've probably experienced this where you're just trying to hire workers and they just simply aren't out there. And it's really hard to attract new workers, hard to keep workers. All of those sorts of things are real challenges. The price level and inflation, we've had 8.2% inflation in the last year, the last 12 months, which is much higher than our average long run inflation of about 3% or so. And so prices are going up, and that means not just prices of workers, but also prices for all of your inputs and everything you need to produce your product, and all of your costs involved. And it's a challenging time because you may not be able to raise the prices of your outputs and the goods you sell necessarily that much. And so margins are really getting pinched tight. The price of gasoline, I want to stick that up here. This was as of last week. Now I believe we're close to $5 a gallon, but even just looking last week, $4.37 a gallon versus $3 a gallon a year ago is a 50% increase in price. And you might, even if you don't necessarily use a lot of gasoline in your business, all of the products that get shipped to you that you ship out have the cost of gas calculated into them. So it affects everything. All of the components you use to produce your products are going to have the cost of gas rolled into them. And so this affects everyone. Interest rates is another one. This is the 1-year treasury bill rate from the Federal Reserve. Right now, you can get a 2% treasury bill rate. A year ago, it was 0.04%. So that's a 2 percentage point higher interest rate. And this is just an example interest rate, but you can pick any of your interest rates that you care about, and you can see they've gone up by at least 2 percentage points in the last year, which has all sorts of ramifications for if you want to borrow money. Now, if you were thinking about maybe expanding your business a few months ago, it made a lot of sense. Now with interest rates going up, maybe you want to hold off on that. So it can have a lot of dramatic effects on a small business. And so, how on earth do you survive as a small business with these changes coming just so fast and furious? And the decades before, we haven't really seen as many changes happening all at once. This is really kind of a unique situation where we've got so much happening so rapidly. And a lot of businesses just kind of shrug and say, well, I'll just wait for things to go back to normal, right? Things will stabilize, and then I'll reassess things. But a lot of businesses can't afford to wait, because if you're a small business, you may be still running in the red a little bit, just trying to get through, make ends meet. And you can't wait 6 months or a year or however long it takes for things to return to normal. And things may never return to normal. I think that the changes we're seeing in the labor market now are going to be at least a permanent fixture for the next few decades, and we're going to have to adapt to them. We can't just say, well, once COVID's over, I'll just go back to hiring people at the same wage in the same position as before, and everyone will show up and work for me. I don't think that's the case anymore. So you really can't afford to wait, and it may not even be possible to wait. Instead, what I want to try to do today is give you maybe some tools to think about how you can respond to all of these forces that are kind of affecting your small business, and even just to understand them. It would be a good step in the right direction, right? There's so many different forces at play here. How do you navigate your business through this economic kind of controlled chaos? And the 3 steps I want to highlight today is first, identifying the market forces that affect your profitability. And then once you've identified them, it's easier to respond to changes in those market forces. And that's a good first step. But then the third thing you really want to do is you need to be able to anticipate future changes. So you're not playing catch up, right? You want to be able to anticipate, okay, what's going to happen with wages? Is it going to be hard for me to hire workers? Is it going to be difficult for me to import components from Asia? I mean, these kind of changes down the road, you want to be prepared for. You don't want them to surprise you, and you have to kind of figure out on the spot what to do. You want to be able to have a plan and be able to deal with these changes. And to kind of help understand the big picture, I want to look at 2 things. I want to look at first just a very broad definition of what a business is. And then I also want to look at something called the 5 forces framework, which is a way to understand all the pressure and the forces that are being applied to a business. So first, what do businesses really do? This is going to be general. So hopefully for any kind of business, you can apply this. At its most basic level, a business takes inputs, and those inputs could be everything from raw materials, lumber, to something like labor. Like you can have accountants, and they could be your inputs in your business. And then it takes these inputs as a firm, and you combine them together using some technology to produce something. Right, so you combine accountants with computers to do taxes, or you combine lumber with a sawmill to create boards or something like that. But you're taking your inputs, you're combining them together to produce something in some way using a technology, and then you get your outputs, and then you have your outputs ready to go, and you find a way to sell your outputs to buyers who want to buy your outputs. And again, this can apply to any kind of business. And as a business owner, your firm really has a lot of control over all of these three things, right? You get to pick what kind of inputs you use. Do you use good quality wood? Do you hire really excellent accountants, or do you hire kind of not so great quality accountants? And then how you combine them to produce the output. Do you have a physical office? Do you do it remotely? All these kinds of decisions. And then the output you get, it's going to be different quality depending on your choices you make. How do you market it? How do you sell it? And so as your firm, it's complicated enough as a business owner to figure all of this out, right? How this entire process. But at the same time, you also have market forces in play that are affecting all of these things, right? They're supply and demand's affecting, the price of your inputs, or maybe the technology you're able to use to produce your output, or maybe what the buyers want to buy from you. And so it's really a constant attack on all sides if you're a small business owner, just to get through the day, to get through the year, to be profitable and to be a successful business. And this kind of lays the background of kind of what the goal of the firm is, or how it operates in a very general sense. But in terms of day-to-day kind of decision makings and even longer term criteria, I want to introduce something that's called the 5 Forces Framework. And this was originally developed as part of in the book Competitive Strategy by Michael Porter back in the 1980s. And it's persisted because it's a very powerful tool, and it's kind of evolved over time. But it's a way to think about all the different factors and forces that are influencing your business, and a way to organize them, and maybe try to create some organization out of the chaos of all of these different market pressures on your business. And so at the core of the 5 Forces Framework is sustainable profits. That's what you want to do as a business owner, right? You want your business to be successful. You want to be able to maintain your profits, pay your employees, pay yourself, grow your business. And all of that stems from sustainable profits. Now, how do you get sustainable profits? Well, you've got these forces at play. One is the power of buyers. And I'm going to go through these a little bit quick, and then we'll talk about each of them individually in a second here. So buyers can affect your profitability, as well as the power of input suppliers, right? So you've got the people you sell your product to and the people that you're buying your inputs from. So if you think of that previous graph, you've got kind of the two ends. But then you also have substitutes and complements. So there are other goods out there that are related to your good in some way, what you produce, and they may be a substitute for what you produce. So it may be an alternative someone else could buy instead, or it might be a complement, something that goes along with what you produce. And so it's important because what happens to that good may affect what's going to happen to your good. You always have the threat of entry, and this is going to depend a lot on the type of business you have. If you have a small coffee shop located in the city, entry might mean another coffee shop showing up, down the block or something like that. Or if you have a global company, then you may have competition from all over the world that's maybe less actually geographically located close to you. And then within your industry, you also have industry rivalry. So you may have competitors that operate either producing the same good you do or a very similar good that you have to deal with. And so at any given moment, you've got kind of all of these 5 different forces at play, pulling, tugging on your profits, trying to, take some of that sustainable profits away from you and, reroute it to somebody else. And I want to go through each of these real quick, just to give you kind of a quick summary of what each represents. So when you think about buyers, right, these are the people that buy your final product. They could walk into your coffee shop and buy a cup of coffee. They could be ordering lumber from you. And in general, what kind of is common to all buyers, and this includes us as individuals too, is we always want to pay less and get more. So there's always this pressure of, I want to pay you less and I want you to give me more. And how effective that pressure is on you depends on a number of different factors. So I'm going to throw up just a couple items here. Some of these are related, but how effective a buyer is at convincing you that they should pay less for your good and get more is going to depend a lot on buyer concentration. So if you have, maybe one large buyer that's buying, the majority of the goods you produce, they're going to have a lot of power in terms of, how the price that they pay. On the other hand, if you maybe have a coffee shop and people come in and out from all over the region, they're not going to be able to kind of get together and consolidate that power. And they're just going to probably come in and pay whatever price you've got listed or not, but they're not going to be able to use that power to try to drive down the price that they pay you and then expect more from you. And then you also have, the price or value of substitute products, right? If there's another coffee shop next to you, then buyers are going to have a lot more power convincing you to lower your price or offer more, benefits than if you're just the only coffee shop in the region. And there's some other points here too, like customer switching costs. How hard is it for a buyer to switch and buy products from some other source? And there may even be government restraints in there. For example, there might be a price ceiling or price floor that affects the price that you can charge, or that the price that you can buy your inputs from in some way. There may be some kind of quota if you're importing products from overseas. There may be a limited amount that the US allows imported every year, or maybe that country only will allow a limited amount exported every year. And so kind of when I'm talking about these the five forces framework, maybe think a little bit about how these factors play into your business. And every business is going to be different. In some, the buyers are going to have a lot of power, and they'll be able to, that'll be kind of like a constant concern for you to deal with. And in others, maybe this is not such a big deal. So you've got the power of buyers that have, the power that buyers have over eventually being able to buy your product. And that's going to put pressure on your profitability. Then you also have the power of input suppliers. So the other end of that line where we produce goods, you have suppliers who supply you with the inputs you need to produce the goods that then you're going to sell. And suppliers are the opposite. They always want to be paid more for the products that they're providing to you. And they also want to deliver less to you each time, right? Because they also are in search of sustainable profits and raising their profit margin. And the amount of power that an input supplier has over your business also depends on a bunch of different factors, including supplier concentration. If they're the only place you can buy the product from, then the input that you need to make your product, then they're going to have a lot of power. And if they demand higher prices, there's not much you're going to be able to do about that. You can see this right now in the infant formula situation in the US, where there's this national shortage of infant formula. And that's because there's really only 2 producers in the entire United States. And one of them just did a bad job producing output, and it had to be discarded. And there's this huge shortage now. And because there's such a concentration in the suppliers of that product, there's a lot of power there, and it can cause seismic shifts in the market for that good. And so understanding how concentrated your suppliers are, also what are the possible alternatives you have if the supplier disappeared overnight? Is there somewhere else I can buy from? Is there some other product that I could replace it with? And what kind of switching costs are in there? Do I have to establish a new relationship, and do we have to have a lot of paperwork back and forth? Is it going to be a time-consuming process, or is it going to be something that's relatively easy and quick to do? And there's also potentially government restraints, just like we saw on the buyer side. You might not be able to import more than a certain quantity of the goods that you need to use as inputs for your product because of input quotas or something like that. And so you always want to be aware of what kind of restraints or what kind of factors here are going to affect the power of input suppliers, so you can be prepared if something happens, right? If you're worried about the concentration of your suppliers and you only have one firm that provides the good for you, you should identify that as a potential challenge in the future and think about, okay, well, what alternatives exist? Is there any way I can start producing, the earlier product I need myself, or can I find an alternative supply of it somewhere? Even if I don't need it now, just to have it there reduces the power that those input suppliers have over you, because you can say, look, I'm not going to pay your higher price because I have these alternatives there. The third force is substitutes and complements. And so substitutes are goods that meet the same basic need that your good does. So, if you make one form of ketchup and then you have a competitor that makes a different form of ketchup, those 2 goods are substitutes, right? A consumer can choose one or the other to use, and you have to worry about what's happening to that substitute good. If your competitor figures out a way to make their product cheaper or better, then that's going to create a lot of pressure on you because to maintain profitability, because you're going to have to respond in some way. And even if they're not competitors and substitutes, you may want to be aware of the goods that are complements or goods that go along with your good. So if maybe you produce an output and it's typically used alongside some other good, you produce one part of a machine and then another company produces another part of the machine. Together, they make the machine. You really want to be paying attention to what's going on with that other company, even though you guys are not competitors. And it's in your best interest for them to be successful too, because only together can you, sell your products and will they be valuable? And so sometimes it's not always the forces on your firm, but it could be the forces on other firms, and then the relationship between your firm and that other firm. And so here's a few examples. Just the price and the value of either complementary or substitute goods and services. You also have network effects. So for example, if you're thinking about, if you're going to maybe make a new software product, right? You're going to make an app. You have to wonder, do I produce it for, iOS, for Apple phones, or do I produce it for Android? Do I produce a product that goes on Macs? Do I produce a product that goes on PCs? Do I do all four? Each of those separate development platforms are going to have different network effects. You're going to reach a different group of consumers, and you're going to be kind of locked out of the other groups of consumers. So you always kind of want to have that in the back of your mind as well. And then one of the biggest or most scary, at least, factors here in the five forces is the idea of entry, right? So you may have your business stabilized, you're making some profit, everything's going good, when all of a sudden some new competitor opens up shop just down the street, and all of a sudden you have to compete in a way that you weren't really prepared for or thought about in the past. And this is something that can happen at any time, and it can happen from different sources that maybe you're not expecting. One example is if you're a grocery store, and I have this a little bit later as an example. Before the pandemic, you might not have really been thinking about Amazon that much, because Amazon doesn't, sell produce really. But then things have changed. Amazon buys Whole Foods. Whole Foods starts doing door delivery, home delivery, and all of a sudden you've got this new competitor that didn't exist, a few months ago, and that you maybe didn't even see coming. So when you think about what kind of entry threats might exist, you can think about the entry costs. How easy is it for some new business to enter into an area? If you're thinking about, if you're a coffee shop, for example, entry costs could be high if you're in a neighborhood where the rent is relatively high and it's difficult for someone to physically locate a new coffee shop there. And then there's a bunch of other things here too. Economies of scale has to do with, can new firms enter and produce at a level of output that is efficient? If there's really only room for maybe one or two firms in a market, then it may not be so easy for another firm to enter. Also things like reputation, it takes time to build a reputation. If a new firm enters, are they going to be able to develop a new reputation that's very positive quickly, or is it going to be something that's going to take them years? And switching costs and government restraints as well. I mean, you've got competitive issues here. If a competitor leaves your market, is it going to give you too much market power, and is that going to be a problem? Or if competitors merge, you may have, antitrust kind of concerns. And I'm trying to just give you a list of some of the big factors here. They're all going to depend, which ones are most important is going to depend a lot on your particular business. But just sitting down and thinking about each of these things and saying, okay, for my business, what are the threats of entry, and what are the things that are going to make it harder for a firm to enter and compete with me? What are the things where maybe it's a sign that it'll be easy and it could happen any moment, but you want to be prepared for those sorts of things. And then the fifth force is industry rivalry. And this is something that you're probably most familiar with if you have competitors. There's always going to be competition from somewhere. And the more intense the competition is, the less profitability there's going to be for everyone in the industry. So, as a small business owner, your dream is to have zero competition, right? Because then you have a lot more flexibility in terms of what you can charge and the type of product you can produce. But in reality, you're always going to have some form of competition, especially if you're in an industry that is making good profits and is a desirable industry. Other firms will look to that industry and say, that's a nice industry I might want to think about getting into. And so you always have rivalry in your industry. And these are just some of the factors that determine how big a force industry rivalry is. If you have a very concentrated industry where it's maybe just you and one other firm, you might not have so much competition because you've kind of figured out how to operate without treading on each other's toes. But if you're in an industry where there's thousands of competitors, right? You're selling handmade jewelry online on Etsy or something like that, it's going to be a very different situation. And industry rivalry is going to be incredibly important. It's going to really drive down your profitability. So things like information, if you have somehow access to better information about where the market's going, then that might give you an upper hand against your rivals in the industry, and types of differentiation in products. So if you can differentiate your product more so than some other product that's competing with you, then that reduces the degree of competition and may help with your profitability. And really all of these 5 forces, you should think about constantly pressuring your business from all sides at all times, and not to get overwhelmed. Understanding which ones are kind of driving the pressure really helps you respond and address that pressure. And I want to give you a couple examples of how you might be able to use this information to increase your profitability and make your business more sustainable. And the first example I want to give is like a restaurant, like a fast food restaurant, and labor. And so if you haven't been paying attention the last few years, the pandemic has made it brutally hard to find workers. So fast food restaurants have signs up, saying we need to hire workers, and it's been really challenging to keep businesses staffed. And this is an example of the power of input suppliers, because as a worker, you are supplying your labor to the businesses. And so here, the pandemic has given a lot of power to workers and a lot of power to the labor suppliers or input suppliers who are workers. And so as a business, maybe you kind of always assumed you could find cheap minimum wage workers, as many as you needed for the summer or for the year, and that's no longer the case. And so being aware of that as a possibility is important. And when this happens, when it became hard to find workers, a lot of businesses didn't really take it too seriously. Kind of maybe the traditional response would be, first, you maybe heard lots of businesses complain, well, nobody wants to work anymore, and they just blame people for being lazy, right? And that's not really an appropriate response from the force that's at hand here, because there's real power in the hands of the input suppliers or the workers here, and just kind of dismissing it isn't going to really solve anything for you, and it's not going to deal with your problems of profitability. So it's kind of a silly thing, even if you've heard it a lot. And then kind of the traditional response after that was finally, okay, well, we're gonna have to do something. So we're gonna just raise wages, and we'll raise prices to go along with it. So you've probably seen in the news, McDonald's and other fast food restaurants have raised their wages significantly. And instead of the minimum wage, now we're seeing $14, $15, $16 an hour, a lot higher than they'd previously done. But even with that, it hasn't really addressed the problem. And even with higher wages, they're not able to find workers to fill all the spots that they need. And a more innovative response is to understand that input suppliers have gained a lot of power. And they've gained power because they've said that they no longer want to work in certain conditions anymore, or in certain environments. And so rather than just throwing more money at the problem and saying, well, we'll just give them more money and then they'll come work for us, a much more innovative way to respond to it is to look at, okay, why don't they want to work in these environments, and what can we do to address that? How can we change our business? And sometimes you can't, and sometimes you just have to find ways to operate with fewer workers. And so some businesses have done this. If you're a retail store, for example, maybe you just have 1 or 2 workers that you can really trust, and you pay them more, and they do the raw jobs of what 2 or 3 workers might have done in the past. Or instead of just throwing higher wages at them, maybe figure out, okay, what is it they want out of a job? During the pandemic, we saw a lot of workers that want things like paid time off, or paid sick leave, or childcare, or better healthcare, or more flexible work environments where they can, take days off if they need to. Even things like requiring the customers to wear masks makes them feel more comfortable, and they're more likely to work in that work environment, or not having to be the ones to enforce mask requirements and get yelled at by customers. And we've seen a lot of businesses, especially fast food and restaurants, kind of revise their business model significantly. So we have some restaurants that have reduced their open hours. So instead of trying to staff the full day, they said, we're only going to be open for dinner now. And maybe it's not ideal, but it's a way that they've kind of responded to those market forces. Or some restaurants have just eliminated in-person dining entirely. A number of fast food restaurants are still doing this, where even though they could safely be open and have people eat dining in, they said it's not worth the effort anymore. It's not worth the hassle. Come drive through, take your food, and go eat it at home, or go somewhere else to eat it. And that's just how we're going to operate our business. We're just not going to be a dine-in establishment anymore. And in this case, one of the things that I think has been kind of a savior for a lot of restaurants and other businesses that face labor problems is that these problems are being faced across the board by everyone. And so at least when you're having to deal with these labor shortages and these labor problems, your competitors are also having to deal with them. So it's not like they can apply the pressure while you struggle with the situation. They're all struggling with the situation. And this actually creates an opportunity, because if you can find a way to solve it, if you can find a way to make your business profitable again and to be stable, then you're actually going to have an upper hand against your competitors, and it's going to reduce the pressure that comes from industry rivalry. Another example is the grocery store. Grocery shopping has changed dramatically in the last two years or so since the pandemic began. One of the main drivers early on was just that customers didn't really feel comfortable shopping in person, especially early on in the pandemic. They didn't know how the virus spread, whether it was, they needed to wear gloves or masks or goggles or what. And so a lot of customers just said, I'm not really comfortable going into a grocery store. And the traditional response is to say, well, okay, if you're worried about your safety when you're in the store, we'll put out hand sanitizer. We'll talk about how we clean every 4 hours. We'll require our staff and customers to wear masks. And that was somewhat effective, but in the same way that just increasing the wages for fast food employees didn't really solve anything, this also doesn't really solve the underlying problem. It kind of is a Band-Aid for it. The businesses that have been more successful in the grocery industry have actually, again, taken kind of a more innovative response to these challenges. So a lot of grocery stores have added or expanded their online ordering. In fact, I don't know of a single grocery store that has not done this. I suspect that if you didn't do this, you would be really struggling for business. If you probably wouldn't have survived the last few years. Things like adding curbside pickup or grocery delivery. And then also collaborating with delivery services. So for a long time, DoorDash was kind of this niche company in big cities that would deliver your, hot food from like the sandwich shop or something. But it's really expanded in these last few years, and it integrates with grocery stores and restaurants to really provide that last step of the process of getting the products to the people and actually bring the goods to you. And by using these delivery services, you have less customers physically in your store, which makes those that do come in feel more comfortable. You can control the safety of those workers. And it's really kind of revised how grocery stores operate. And I don't think it's going away, because a lot of customers, even if it was originally because they felt unsafe shopping in person, really like the convenience and are willing to pay a premium so that they don't have to spend an hour of the day driving to the grocery store and looking for what they want and checking out, and it can just show up on their doorstep. And yeah, it's expensive, but that might be worth my time. And I think I mentioned this already, but this has also led to all sorts of interesting competition where a grocery store might not have looked to something like Amazon, or there are these online grocery and food subscription services where you get all the ingredients to your front door and instructions on how to make the meals. And those were kind of separate always from grocery. They didn't really compete directly. You kind of thought of, okay, that's a novelty subscription thing that some people do. But with the pandemic and the ability to get fresh groceries delivered to your front doorstep, these things have become a lot more competitive with the grocery store. So you really have all these new entries that are competing with grocery stores that you never would have thought would have been a factor, a couple of years ago. And so again, here, if you can respond and take these market changes as an opportunity to improve your business and find ways to be successful when your competitors aren't, then this can actually be almost a windfall, right? I mean, it's a way to reduce your competition because your competitors can't keep up in a sense. And if you just lay back and say, well, I'll just wait for things to go back to normal, then you're going to be run over all along the way. And so as a small business, you really need to identify those market forces that will affect your profitability and figure out how to change your behavior in response to those market forces. So not just simply say, well, I'll just wait for things to settle out and go back to normal. You need to figure out, okay, how can I respond? And not just the bare minimum response of throwing more money at the problem, but actually thinking about, okay, is this an opportunity for me to innovate? And by innovating, will I kind of rethink how my business operates in a way that makes it more profitable, more sustainable in the long run, and actually much more competitive, considering the rivals that I have in the industry. And then the last thing is, if you can handle those two things, the real strength comes in if you can anticipate future changes in the market forces. Because if you've been able to anticipate going into the pandemic, some of the changes that would have happened, you were really in a position to, grow your business exponentially. Right? If you had been there, able to, anticipate that, people would be staying home and the types of goods they wanted, if you could, have built toilet paper factories, right? A couple of weeks before the pandemic started, you could have made millions, right? So being able to anticipate the future changes in market forces is almost as important as knowing how to respond to them. It's a way to be proactive instead of reactive to changes. And so I want to give you a tool that helps you understand a little bit how market forces may change in the future when you see things happening today. And this tool is supply and demand. So if you've taken an economics course before, you're probably familiar with supply and demand. If you haven't, it's a really powerful tool that can kind of guide you and kind of give you insight into the way market forces are going to be changing, what's going to happen to prices, interest rates, and all those sorts of things. And I'm going to give you like a crash course in it, because when I teach microeconomics, we spend 2-3 weeks looking at supply and demand in depth, but I'm going to give you like the one slide version. So the one slide version is that demand reflects the value consumers place on the good. So how much happiness, how much joy, how much value they get out of buying and consuming the good. And on the other side of the market is the supply, and supply reflects essentially the cost of producing and delivering that good. So if you think of demand as the value consumers place in that good, and supply is the cost of producing that good, those are pretty good ways to think about how changes will play out in the supply and demand model. So if something changes the value consumers get from the good, if something makes your good seem more valuable, that's going to increase the demand for your good. If something raises the cost of producing your good, that's going to decrease the supply for your good. And the supply and demand model has a graph and pictures and lines and all that sorts of stuff, but it really only boils down to just 4 things that can happen in the supply and demand model. You've got demand, you've got supply, and either demand can increase or decrease, and either supply can increase or decrease. And those are really the only 4 things that can come out of the entire supply and demand model, out of the weeks that we studied in microeconomics. And you can just remember these 4 things, if that kind of is a cheat sheet to kind of understand supply and demand. If there's an increase in demand, that means the price of the good you're looking at is going to rise, it's going to become a more expensive good, and there's going to be more bought and sold. On the other hand, if demand decreases, the opposite happens. The price is going to fall and less is going to be bought and sold. That's the demand side. So if something changes the value the consumers place on the good, that's going to affect demand. If something changes the cost of producing and delivering that good, that's going to affect supply. And you could have an increase in supply. And if supply increases, that means the price of the good is going to fall and more is going to be bought and sold. And a decrease in supply is going to be the opposite. The price of the good is going to rise and less is going to be bought and sold. So it kind of in a single slide, this is supply and demand. And these are the 4 things that can happen. Whenever there's some kind of shock in the world, it's going to cause one of these 4 things: increase in demand, decrease in demand, increase supply, decrease in supply of the good you're talking about. And on the right, you can see what those effects will be on the price and the quantity bought and sold. We can be, fancy and have multiple effects happen. You can have like an increase in demand at the same time as an increase in supply, but that's getting fancy, and you don't even need that to be able to kind of anticipate most of the basic kind of market shocks. And so let me give you an example of how understanding how supply and demand, these kind of 4 possibilities affect the price and good and quantity bought and sold for good, can be used to kind of anticipate what's going to happen in the market. So one example, the stay-at-home order during the pandemic, and we'll look at the market for toilet paper, right? So back in March, April 2020, various governments said, hey, we're going to have everybody stay at home for a certain amount of time, only essential people out and about, because we're concerned about COVID-19. And it's pretty easy to look at that and say, well, okay, if I'm thinking about toilet paper, right, a very common household good, how is this stay-at-home order going to affect the market for toilet paper? And you're going to think about, does it affect the cost of producing and getting toilet paper to people? Not so much. I mean, that's more going to have to do with the factories and kind of the production side of things, but it's going to affect the value consumers place on toilet paper. All of a sudden, toilet paper is going to become much more important if everybody's staying home all the time instead of going to work and traveling around. And so if toilet paper becomes more valuable to consumers, that's going to increase the demand for toilet paper. Right? And when the demand for toilet paper increases, going back to that kind of the 4 possible outcomes there, you're going to have the price of toilet paper is going to go up and more is going to be bought and sold. And so that's what we saw early on in the pandemic. Everybody was rushing out to the store to buy toilet paper. Prices on toilet paper were really high. People were buying, no-name generic toilet paper for exorbitant prices, which they wouldn't even looked at, a few months earlier. And so this is a way to kind of predict what's going to happen. Now, Could you have guessed that toilet paper was going to be the product that everybody went crazy over? That's a little bit harder to say. But once you think about how the toilet paper market is connected to the economic shock, it becomes pretty obvious what's going to happen. And there's supply side issues too that were going on, but the big overall effect was the decrease in demand for toilet paper. Another example, the war in Ukraine and gasoline prices. So anytime there's political uncertainty, military uncertainty, the threat of a war, gasoline prices are generally going to go up. Some of it is legitimate, like gasoline pipelines might be going through the countries involved. Some of it is simply just concern over the instability. But whenever you have the threat of war, oil prices are going to rise and gasoline prices are going to rise, which is going to decrease the supply of gasoline. So in general, the supply of gasoline has decreased over the last 6 months to a year or so. And as the supply of gasoline decreases, that's going to raise the price of gasoline, and less is going to be bought and sold. And so that's what we see now. The price of gasoline is skyrocketing. People are trying to find ways to avoid buying gasoline, bicycling more, things like that. And so you're going to have less gasoline bought and sold than we did before the threat of the war in Ukraine. A third example is the great reassessment of labor. 6 months, a year ago, I had been talking a lot about what the long-term implications were going to be for workers coming out of the pandemic. And even that long ago, it was fairly easy to predict what would happen, because one of the effects of the pandemic was that the cost of working has increased dramatically. And what do we mean by the cost of working exactly? Well, here the cost could be an opportunity cost, right? Or what you could be doing instead. So once you're in the pandemic, maybe daycares are closed, maybe the nursing home where your parents or grandparents are is closing, or you want to pull them out of that. And so what you could be doing instead of working suddenly becomes much more important, right? Staying home with the kids, taking care of loved ones that are maybe sick with COVID, just enjoying being with your family. All of these things increase the opportunity cost of working, or what you're giving up when you make the decision to work. And so when the opportunity cost of work increases, and there's also actual costs of not just opportunity costs, but real costs involved with working too, because you're putting yourself more at risk. You're going out into kind of this unknown pandemic where you might get infected and become sick and bring it home to your family. Those are real costs that would affect the decision to work or not. And so all of these increases in the cost of working is going to decrease the supply of labor. And going back to the kind of the four outcomes you can get from the supply and demand model, just like with gasoline, when the supply of something decreases, the price is going to go up, which in this case is the price of labor or wages. And there's going to be less bought and sold of labor, which is going to be fewer people employed, people wanting to work less. And that's exactly what we see right now in the labor market. It's hard to find workers. Wages, you have to raise wages quite a bit in order to convince people to come work for you. And so it's a direct kind of application of the supply and demand model. And the reason that I wanted to do the supply and demand model is that, in hindsight, some of these things maybe seem obvious, but if you're looking for it or asking, okay, what is the effect of something happening today going to be on this market? And if you can predict that and you understand how, that market is going to affect your business, then you're 2 or 3 steps ahead of a lot of other businesses, because you're prepared, what's going to be coming down the line. You can start thinking about ways to kind of respond and address that. And just using kind of supply and demand, I want to give you some kind of predictions. So, if you ask me, where do I see the economy going in the next 6 months or so, I'm going to give you some predictions. Again, take these with a grain of salt, because they may be proven totally wrong, or something else can happen after today that changes everything. But if you had to ask me where we're going to be in 6 months or so, I would say we're probably going to see interest rates continuing to rise. The Federal Reserve has kept interest rates at record low levels for quite some time in order to stimulate the economy. Now the economy is heating up. We're getting inflation, output is growing, GDP is rising. So we're probably going to see interest rates continue to rise. They've already taken steps to raise interest rates. It's going to continue to happen. We're probably going to see 2 or 3 more times in the next year, the Federal Reserve raising interest rates. And this has all sorts of consequences for your business, right? The cost of investing or expanding will rise. If you were considering taking out a loan to expand your business, 3 to 6 months ago was probably the ideal time to do it. It's still probably a good time to do it, but it's going to be a whole lot better now than it is in 6 months or a year down the road. So this means that you're probably going to be less likely to expand your business in a year. It means your competitors are less likely to expand their business in a year. Maybe they'll do it now. And so you can think about how that might affect your business and then respond to that as well. I think prices and inflation are going to continue to rise as well. Gasoline prices in particular are probably going to remain very high for some time, not just because of the war in Ukraine, but also the economic uncertainty and inflation that we see. And so you need to anticipate that. If your business involves a lot of travel, maybe it's time to find ways to limit that, do more virtual type things, or find cheaper ways to ship your products, because I don't think gas prices are going to come down anytime soon. And this is also going to put pressure on all your input costs, materials and labor, the goods that you use to produce your output and that you're going to sell. It's going to become more and more expensive to produce those goods. And you're going to have to think about ways to either cut costs or to raise the price of your output in order to continue to compete. And then the third thing that I think is kind of just on the horizon that maybe hasn't been given enough focus are some of the supply chain challenges. We've seen some supply chain challenges during the pandemic. And it kind of feels like we've kind of sorted those out, but I think that's a misconception. They're kind of lurking under the surface. Here are some very serious supply chain challenges that will probably worsen down the road, in particular because in terms of China and a lot of the East Asian countries that we involve in a lot of our production, they haven't really been hit as hard with COVID as maybe the rest of the world. China has been very active at limiting the spread of COVID, kind of a zero COVID approach. And it's becoming obvious that they're not going to be able to maintain that with the more infectious Omicron variants and future variants. And at the same time, they don't have a high proportion of their population vaccinated. You might think, well, they've had lots of time, they've been protected, why haven't they vaccinated more people? Well, there's all sorts of reasons, but we in the United States have vaccinated those that are at highest risk, those that are 65 years and older, at much higher rates, 90, 95% than in China, where maybe they're only at 60, 65%. And so once you have outbreaks of COVID-19 in China that are spreading, and I think we're almost at that point now, if maybe we were already at that point, you're going to see long-term and dramatic ramifications in terms of our supply chain that we haven't really even considered yet. And I've talked to small business owners that their product is assembled in part or entirely in China that have gone 3 to 6 months without product to sell because they literally cannot get it assembled and shipped to the United States. And so it's worth asking yourself, okay, what would I do if this input I use in my product suddenly became unavailable from the sources that I normally rely on? How would I respond? Can I find a more local source? Can I find an alternative? Can I do it myself? Stuff like that is going to be important questions to ask yourself now rather than in 6 months or so when we start to see problems. And so these are just a few predictions. You can look around and you can see the way things are going, and it's not that hard to predict what the consequences might be, especially if you understand a little bit about supply and demand and how that might affect your businesses. So in summary, I just want to kind of remind you what I tried to do today was introduce the 5 forces framework to kind of identify the forces that affect your profitability in your business. And it can be an overwhelming laundry list of forces, but if you can organize them into the groups that I have here, it makes it a little easier to think about. And then think about ways that you would respond to those forces applying more pressure to you. And there are very traditional ways to respond, but those traditional ways may not be enough if these are real seismic shifts in how the economy operates, and you may need to think about more innovative responses. And then if you can, try to look around you and see the trends that are happening in the economy and think about, okay, what is going to happen 6 months down the road? Can I predict what's going to happen to the price of my product or the price of my competitors or the inputs that I need to produce my product? And if you can do that, then you're in a position to respond faster and more decisively, which is going to give you an advantage over your competitors who might just say, hey, everyone's lazy and doesn't want to work anymore, while you're kind of reimagining what working at your business is like, and you're going to suck up all the great workers and leave them kind of behind in the dust. So that's kind of the goal of what I talked about today. I do want to give you a chance to ask some questions or maybe talk about some of the economic challenges that have affected your business and the ways you've dealt with them. But first, I got to plug one thing. I teach in the IU Northwest MBA program, and some of this material today was adapted from my managerial economics class that I'm teaching right now. And I want to tell you a little bit about the MBA program, since I've got you here kind of as a captive audience. Our program is really unique. It focuses on leadership, teamwork, and analytical problem solving. And it's really flexible. We have both an accelerated weekend program where you meet every other Saturday for 18 months and then you're done. And we also have a somewhat more traditional weeknight program where you meet in the evenings to complete your coursework, and it's a little bit more at your own pace. You can take classes as you're ready for them. And it's really affordably priced. It's cheaper than most other MBA programs that you can find in the area. It's AACSB accredited, which is like the highest accreditation you can get essentially. Less than 5% of all business schools worldwide are AACSB accredited. And we've had it for many decades even now. And there's all sorts of cool bonus added on features, like we do Lean Six Sigma certification, if you're familiar with that is. The weekend program goes to an international business experience where they travel around the world and they visit businesses in other countries that are related to their businesses and learn how they do business. And so if you haven't considered an MBA program in the past, or maybe thought they're too expensive or difficult for you to do with your current job, I asked you to think about this program because I think it's a really excellent program. And when we talk about the things like we talked about today, and it's not just economics, it's accounting and human resources and teamwork and leadership and everything else that we do. So I just wanted to kind of plug that real quick.